Kathryn Carney-Feldman, Ipswich Conservation Commission, and today's segment of our video is on coastal resource areas. I can't think of a better place than being at the famous Ipswich Cranes Beach. And to help me describe why coastal resource areas are so important is Kathryn Glenn, and she is the North Shore Area Coordinator for the Coastal Zone Management. Welcome, Kathryn.
Thank you.
Would you like to tell me a little about what Coastal Zone Management is?
Sure. Coastal Zone Management is an office within the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, and our office is responsible for balancing the impact of human activity to the protection of the resource areas within the coastal zone.
And how would your company help Ipswich as a whole?
ICAM works with communities like Ipswich on a regular basis to work with the conservation commissions, for example, in giving technical assistance on resource areas and possibly impact of projects that are proposed for the coastal resource areas. We help communities come up with ideas that might have lesser impact than what might be proposed. We also work with communities to do planning for resource area management, and we have a number of other issue areas that we work with communities on.
Well, I'm happy you're around.
Thank you. Okay, so this is a really great visual of the system that we're going to be discussing today. You can see that the entire region here with Crane Beach coming down this way and the entire Castle Neck coming this way. You can really see the entire Barrier Beach system here with the, obviously the ocean out here, the beach in here, and then in this area the dunes coming back to the salt marsh. And you can really see from this visual how it's one big system made up of a number of smaller systems within it. And we're going to be talking today a little bit about the different systems that make up the Barrier Beach here at Castle Neck.
Few people really realize, especially those that live here in Ipswich, because we know how beautiful this whole area is, few people realize that actually we've only started looking upon this as a resource to be protected. It wasn't until 1963 with the passing of the Jones Act that we actually had our first act protecting our areas, the coastal areas, and that was passed by the Massachusetts legislature. Later it was incorporated in the Wetlands Protection Act of 1972. So as I said, it's only been recently that we've actually valued and protected these beautiful resources.
Yeah, there's been a lot of impact to the coastline of Massachusetts over time, and it really has been only the last many decades, as you said, since the 60s, that it's really been protected by law. There's been a lot of impacts to our coastal salt marsh, for example, with building. Much of Boston is built on a filled coastal wetland, for example, and there are a lot of other areas on our coastline that have been filled since we began building. But yeah, now we're much more aware now of what the impacts are. We're much more aware of the value of our coastal wetlands.
In fact, that's probably the reason why we're here today, is to really go over why all these areas are so valuable.
Right.
It's not just for the aesthetic beauty alone and for the recreation that it provides, but there's many other values, and we're going to be talking about that in this part of the video.
Right.
There are many coastal resource areas that we could talk about, but we're going to only be talking about a few of them today.
Yeah, when we talk about a coastal resource area, really what we're talking about, as we looked at on that visual that we talked about a little bit earlier, it's a large system and it's all interconnected. So while we look at different areas that have different sort of function within that area, it is all one big system and it interacts very importantly with each other. So it's an important thing to think about when we're talking about coastal resource areas. So if we sort of start in the ocean, if you will, the areas that sort of interact with the coastline, because we're really talking about where the land meets the water. The land under the ocean, which is really the seafloor, when we're talking about that, extends from the low tide mark all the way out to sort of jurisdiction for coastal communities. And it obviously is very important for habitat. It's very important for the biological resources that live in the ocean, that we protect that underwater area, the land under the water. There's hard bottoms, there's soft bottoms. They all have different habitat values. As you come closer to shore, There's the area we sort of talk about as the near shore area because it's nearer shore, more shallow. There are other resources, other important aspects of that resource, primarily sort of the storm damage prevention and flood control aspect of that people don't really think about very often. But the topography of the bottom of the ocean near shore is very key to how waves come into the land, how they hit, how large they are, where that energy is tripped up, whether it's, as you can see out here, there's the sandbar exposed today at low tide that's tripping up some waves. You can see the waves breaking out there. That's a very important function. You have similar sort of topography under the ocean that doesn't quite break the surface, and those sort of sand waves under the ocean are breaking up energy as it's coming in as well. Also important there is that when we have waves coming into shore, a lot of times you have the sand all the time. You have the sand moving. It's never static. It's a very, very dynamic community for a beach system, a coastal resource system. So the sediment is moving from the nearshore area onto the beach. It's moving from the beach into the nearshore area. It's moving up and down the beach all the time. It's moving from the beach into the dunes, and we'll talk about that a little bit. From the dunes back into the beach area. So it's really one large system that's interacting with each other.
I think it probably would be a good time to really talk about the fact that the dynamics, the fact that the beach, the coastal areas are always in movement. I'm not sure if everybody really realizes how much movement there is unless after a storm in the winter, they see that a dune is moved, they see that there's erosion and so on, but it's a very important thing to know that this is a system that's constantly on movement.
Yeah, and it's very important that it be able to move because it really reacts to the energy that is put into it. So when you have a very large storm, for example, in the wintertime, a lot of the sand that you see on the beach in the summertime will be moved offshore, and it will sit offshore in that nearshore area, and it will intercept some of the energy of those big storm waves coming in and trip it up before it has a bigger impact on the land area. You'll also have, the dunes will be eroded, and that sand will go into use in the same way. Moving up and down the coast, the sand is constantly in motion as the waves come in at an angle. It sort of pushes the sand down in a longshore current and moves that sand along to other areas. So you have deposits where you have larger sandbars, for example, in different areas. Very, very important for the function of the beach.
Great, and with that, let's segue right into some tidal flats that we can see starting to show up right now because we've got low tide coming.
So here we're looking at the tidal flats that are associated with the beach here at Crane State, and you can really see two pieces of the beach. To the left you can see the tidal flats, and those are very important for, as we talked about, storm damage prevention and flood control to prevent waves from hitting the larger beach, but they're also a very, very important habitat for shellfish, and it's a great place for shorebirds, for example, to do their foraging. So it's a very essential area for that reason. Here in Ipswich, we know that, the very, very famous soft-shell clam that Ipswich is famous for around the world is dug out of the mudflats here in Ipswich and other areas nearby. And that is an extremely important piece of the economy in this location. So you can really think about the importance of the mudflats here in Ipswich. I think those are pretty well known. So above the tidal flat area on the beach is the area above high tide, and you can kind of see that as you're looking down the beach. You can see the area where it sort of gets dry and it comes up, and there's that berm that comes up, and then a little bit of a back beach that sort of slopes back to the coastal dune. That area, of course, is the place where most people want to put their towel when they come to the beach in the summertime. It's a great place to recreate. It is also very, very important for storm damage and flood control. The form and the volume of the beach, the way that it's shaped, is very important to maintain, to make sure that we're keeping that ability of the sand to move and migrate and dissipate storm energy when we do have those great big storms. And here you can also see, as we get up into the dune, you can see where it starts to slope up. You can see where the vegetation starts to form. That's when we're starting to get into the dune system from the beach. And in this shot, you can kind of see an area of vegetation that might, it's out on the beach, but that's an area that could start to trap sand, that could start to form new dunes as the sand gets trapped in it by the wind. You can also, over here, we can kind of see the scarping, which over towards the right. area that's been eroded.
In fact, right in front of us right now, we have one of the dynamics, an example of dynamics of the sand dune, and that has to do with erosion.
The sand dunes respond to the conditions that we're under. So if we have high water, if we have a storm event, for example, you can see on this dune that it's actually had some wave action that has eroded the front portion of it. But you can also see that this dune is very, very well vegetated, in part because it's protected, as you can see by the fence that runs around it, to keep people from sort of traipsing through it. As you look closely at the, and I'm going to walk right over here and do this if that's all right. If you look closely at the area that has been eroded away, you can see the grass sort of sticking out of it. It has this great root system for beach grass. Beach grass actually responds to being covered by sand by growing, so it's really a great plant to have on a dune, and it really does have this great root system that holds the sand in place and binds the sand. So a vegetated dune is much more stable under erosive conditions than one that doesn't have the vegetation. So you can see a large area of vegetation here, but you can also see that it is impacted by the waves when the waves come up. And then you can see vegetation starting to grow again down at the bottom here. As the conditions change, the dune starts to migrate out again and capture that sand.
One of the things that I think it would be worthwhile to explain to our viewing public is how delicate beach grass is. And in fact, if you walk on it twice, you can kill it, and there's a reason for that.
Yeah, beach grass, I mean, vegetation on a dune is very fragile. It's one of the reasons that these dunes are managed to keep people from walking through them. It doesn't take very many passages across a coastal dune to cause what we call a blowout, an area where the grass will die. And what's really happening is that the sand grains kind of move like little gears down as you step on them. They get to the rhizome, the root of the plant, and sort of cut through it as you're walking across it. It doesn't take very many trips back and forth to cause that to happen. If you're walking in the same place over and over, you're likely to cause a path. And then the wind can come in and start to scour that path out, and now you've got a blowout in the dune. So we can contrast the dune. The dune is very important, as we've talked about, sort of a sediment supply for the beach. It holds that sand until there's a storm event, and then it begins to erode. That sand goes back out into the system, onto the beach, into the near shore. But we also have sources of sediment that we've talked about how the sediment moves around a lot on the beach, but there has to be a source as well. One of the sources that we have are coastal banks, and you can see in this shot, this is the end of Plum Island, and that is a drumlin, a classic sort of glacial landform that we have many of here in New England. And it is eroding on the front face of it, and you can see that there is it's kind of a distance away, but you can see that there's erosion happening on that front face. Eroding coastal banks are an exceptionally important coastal resource here in Massachusetts, because without them we wouldn't have our beaches. We need to have a source of sediment to the beach. So if we're not allowing any of the coastal banks to erode, then we won't have our coastal beaches around for very long. So that's an important sort of resource area. But I also wanted to contrast that with the dunes, which also erode in a storm event, but they sort of have a slightly different functions. Most of Castle Neck is a barrier beach, as we've discussed, and we'll discuss more in a bit. But there are areas of the coastline where there are coastal beaches that are not barrier beaches, and those are the areas that are fronting glacial landforms. And you see here Castle Hill sort of rising up out of the beach here. The area, the beach in front of that, which we don't have directly in this shot, but the beach in front of that would be a coastal beach as opposed to a barrier beach. It doesn't protect a wetland behind the system. It's just a beach with a landform behind it that was formed by the glaciers. Okay, so we wanted to just talk about this system as the large system that it is. Castle Neck is a barrier beach, which means that the entire system is a resource area that needs protection. It functions as one large system. So you have the nearshore area, you have the tidal flats, and then you move up and you have the beach, and that's all interacting with each other. Also interacting with that are the dunes, and you have the very first line of dunes, the primary dunes that are very, very important to storm damage prevention, flood control for areas inside. And then as you move backwards, you can see the secondary dunes, those very large dunes here on Castle Neck. And as you move back even further, you get to what we call a maritime forest, which is an area of dunes that is so stable that has been able to grow up vegetation to the state of actually being a small forest that grows here. The entire system, all the way back beyond the forest to the salt marsh in the back, is one large resource area that's protected as a barrier beach. So it is one system that is comprised of a number of smaller resource areas that we've discussed previously. And I think we're going to do a little bit more discussion about salt marsh in a little bit.
One of the things we want to bring up is the beach is not only important to the lives of human beings, but there's other beings that depend on this environment for their life as well.
This area here is very, very important for wildlife habitat as well. And one of the things that you can kind of see, I'm not sure if you can see the birds in the background, there are some shorebirds that are foraging here today. This area here is one of the most important areas in the northeast for shorebirds that are migrating along the eastern seaboard to stop and sort of forage for food within the rack line, which is the area where the seaweed sort of washes up onto the shore, and the birds get a lot of their nutrients, and that they are literally fueling up for their long trip going south.
And we certainly want to talk about the piping plovers and the terns that are here as well.
Yes, this is a very important habitat for endangered species such as piping plovers, and there are also tern nesting habitat here on Cranes and also on Plum Island.
Here we are standing in front of the Great Marsh. It is a very specific marsh, and it is an environment that was considered so necessary, so critical, that it was protected. And to give a little history of that, Kathryn will fill in.
Thanks. We're standing in front of the part of the marsh that the Castle Neck resource area that we were just looking at is protecting, and that is part of the Great Marsh. The Great Marsh is a very large salt marsh that runs from Gloucester all the way to into New Hampshire actually, and a portion of that was designated in 1979 by the Secretary of Environmental Affairs as an area of critical environmental concern because it provides so much in the way of value for economics and environment and ecology and habitat. So what we're looking at here is a portion of that ACEC, as we call the area of critical environmental concern. And some of the things that the ACEC contributes to, for example, it is part of the flyway, I think we talked about that earlier, where the about 80% of the migrating birds that are coming south for the winter come through here to feed. The ACEC is about just over 25,000 acres of salt marsh and barrier beach and beaches and dunes, of which about 10,000 acres are salt marsh, which makes it the largest salt marsh north of Long Island, New York. So it's a very important.
In fact, this is the whole story of our video today. This is the area that the barrier beach is protecting.
The salt marshes provide a lot of important functions, including habitat. It's a nursery for fisheries. We hear about that all the time, that there are a large number of species that will spend a portion of their life cycle here in the salt marsh that are important for us commercially. It helps to reduce pollution to our ocean waters. It provides flood damage, storm damage in a high storm event when you have coastal flooding. The salt marsh provides a great deal of buffer for us for that sort of thing. Slows down the storm waves, absorbs some of that energy that's coming in.
Ipswich is often defined by the exquisite beauty of its environment. Much of that common perception has to do with how its water bodies uniquely interact with its land formations. Crane Beach and the Great Marsh are priceless wetlands that are known far and wide for their natural beauty and recreational value. What is less known and understood is their immeasurable value in protecting drinking water, preventing storm damage, and providing fish, shellfish, and wildlife habitat. As residents of Ipswich, we need to learn about our wetlands and then share this knowledge with others. To know is to understand. To understand is to love. And to love will bring the wish to protect and preserve. Thus, we will ensure that future generations will also reap the benefits of this unique commonwealth.